Okay, this is actually a terrific panel. I'm glad to say I had something to do with assembling it. You heard from Cynthia Estlin and others that the artificial intelligence movement is going to displace tons of work. No one's going to have any jobs, or it's going to lead to massive substitution of jobs. It's going to lead to a reduction in wages, evisceration of the American way of life, or there's uncertainty. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Is this an occasion now to sort of open up American social policy in new ways? And we've got some terrific people. One way to think about it is if artificial intelligence is improving the welfare of the society, making the society richer and more productive, should the losers be compensated in some way? You know, we have this in other areas, like the trade adjustment assistance area. It's not worked perfectly, but people displaced by liberalized trade practices, maybe there are other things we can do. So we're looking at 4 proposals. There may be others out there. I think Cynthia Estlin said, let's spread work at the same pay. You know, this is an occasion now to do whatever you want. Put it in there. Put in whatever you want. I'm putting in a measure, increase average height. Why not? Why not? You know, I am suffering from the trauma of possibly being displaced by a computer, by software, and so I should be compensated. Is that the argument, or is there a better argument going on here than that? So we're going to look at a couple of different proposals. Our first is going to be on ESOPs, employee share ownership, and we've got the leading expert in the country, and I don't think anyone can gainsay me on this, Joseph Blasi of Rutgers University School of Management. And this ESOPs is an idea, a proposal, a measure that has had historically strong bipartisan support. And it's a way of improving the welfare of workers by giving them a greater share in the company. Now, there's one proposal out there, it's the Bernie Sanders proposal, which I call the free proposal. Whatever you want, you get it for free. And Bernie Sanders is suggesting let's take, I don't know, what percentage of stock?
1 to 2% of stock.
Oh, that's not much. They can.
No, each year.
Oh, each year, 1 to 2% each year. Just take it from the companies and give it to the workers, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Professor Blasi is featured in the most important international economics publication out there, The Economist, going head-to-head with Bernie Sanders. And he is really a person on the liberal democratic side of things, but he's being quoted in The Economist magazine as the defender of U.S. capitalism. So this is a new, is that right or wrong?
Yes.
It's in a way. And so take a look at this week's Economist. I can't read The Economist anymore because my dean has denied me a salary increase. I don't feel I can afford it any longer. But it's the weapons of mass disruption is the issue of The Economist, and it's the blue-collar capitalist column of Schumpeter, which is a famous economist, sociologist, Joseph Schumpeter. So this is a real treat. Joe Blasi on ESOPs. How can we broaden the availability of employee stock ownership plans? Joe. I hope that did justice to you, Joe.
Thank you, sir. I need the clicker.
Clicker.
Oh, actually, I have this.
Joe,
Okay,
here's-
fine.
You got one right here, Joe.
Thank you very much.
See, technology can be non-enabling.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sam. I've really enjoyed my long, multi-decade association with Sam and participating in these events. So just to start out with, I'm at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University. Last year, the provost and the president and the dean set up the first and the only institute studying capital shares in the world. We have about 150 research fellows that we've awarded fellowships to over the last
Wow, fantastic.
10 years. But right now, I'm going to talk really about only policy. There's a lot of detailed statistical data and articles available for the website, but let's just jump right into it. So you'll have to ask you to bear with me. I just abandoned bifocals, and I can only see big things. So I'm going to try to make 3 points today. First, capital shares. which are employee equity participation or profit sharing. And by employee equity participation, I mean ESOPs, which finance worker trusts to buy stock using credit without the worker paying for the shares. I mean employee stock purchase plans where employees over 15 million in the United States buy stock at a 15% discount to market. I mean grants of stock to employees such as Microsoft and Google give in restricted stock units and performance shares. And then cash profit sharing and deferred profit sharing, made famous by FDR's incredible bipartisan work with Senator Arthur Vandenberg to create deferred profit sharing plan tax incentives over 70 years ago. Okay. So my first point is going to be that capital shares are a reasonable and one of the only workable solutions to economic inequality. I just want to make 3 points today. My second point will be that capital shares are widely understood and supported in the U.S. economy. And the last point will be there are many robust bipartisan capital share policy options. And by the way, let me say that I think the goals that Senator Sanders has articulated are good goals to expand capital shares. I will conclude with my last slide by showing there are a wide variety of modest bipartisan policy alternatives to get there that don't require compelling companies to do it. So that's a difference of opinion. Okay, so let's get started. All right. Another minus for technology, Sam. Okay. Capital shares, a reasonable approach. So 74% of all capital wealth, all types of wealth, and 97%, incredible figure, of all capital income, all capital gains and every year interest dividends are concentrated in the richest 10% of families. So this is the well-known Saez and Zuckman, the most recent numbers. I just checked with these guys by email. These are the most recent numbers they have. All right, this is bordering feudalism statistical measures. Let's not joke about what this really is. And true, a lot of the concentration is at the top half of 1% and 1%, but we are on the road to feudalism with the Constitution. That's the road that we are on. Second point, while there are approaches at the lower income levels to address inequality, and you've heard and we'll hear of some of them today, such as the EITC, minimum wage, training for career ladders, I think that effective approaches above these income levels are really hard to identify. I am a union member, but we're not going to unionize most of the workforce in next 24 or 48 months. Just ain't going to happen. And there's all kinds of other things that we could do. Thirdly, this shares approach, its goal is to directly broaden the access of the working middle class to that capital wealth and that capital income by radically encouraging broad-based employee share ownership and profit sharing. Now, the part of the policy options I'm talking about is that their impact would be radical, but their mechanism would not be radical. Okay, that's the big point that I'm going to make. So let's look at the data that capital shares are widely understood. So in the year 2000, Rutgers commissioned questions on the U.S. General Social Survey done by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. The gold of the realm other than the U.S. Census to understand attitudes and behaviors of the U.S. population about these various kinds of share plans. So there are a thin layer of capital shares in the business economy. About 20% of all U.S. workers report having sub-shares of stock in their employer, median $15,000. About 8.7% of all U.S. workers report having stock options. Now, that might really surprise you because there are only about 3,300 stock market companies with, as you know, about 6 to 8 named executive officers reporting to the SEC. Stock options are very broadly spread in the United States. And I want you to know that proportionally, there are more union employees holding stock in their employer and more union employees holding stock options than non-union employees. Yes, you heard it right the first time. Proportionally more union employees. That's the exact opposite of what you think these statistics would find. Unions have already arrived at capital shares. Profit sharing, 38% of all U.S. workers report some profit sharing, but amounts are very low, median of 2,000. And gain sharing, 30% of all U.S. workers report some gain sharing. Again, median very low at 2,000. Again, twice as many union workers are involved in gain sharing plans. I've been in a long association with the United Steelworkers, served on the board of some of their companies for Lynn Williams. Gain sharing is a very big part, as you know, of income for steelworkers.
Just to clarify, it's not stock, though.
No,
It's
it's
some
not stock.
measurable gain
Right,
from a joint agreement.
Right.
And that's shared.
right. And so I call all of this shares. Just reduce it to one word, okay? Two words you want, capital shares. The surprise from the General Social Survey data is that 46.8% of all adult workers in the United States have one or more of these. So it might be odd for you to know that in Google, they have grants of shares, they have gain sharing, and they have stock options. In ESOPs, 70% of ESOP workers have cash profit sharing. And there's all these various combinations. There is an emerging kind of share economy at low levels. Okay, so let's go forward. Now, capital shares are widely supported by the public. 4 years ago, I asked the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago to do a public measure of preference for this concept. Okay, 72% of all adult workers, if given a choice between an employee ownership model, an investor-owned model, and a state-owned model, 72% support the employee-owned model. But that's not the surprise. The surprise is that when you break it down by politics, it's 72% of Republicans for the employee ownership model, 74% of Democrats, 67% of independents, and there are really no significant statistical differences here. 69% of conservatives, 72% of liberals, 73% of moderates. And for me, the big shocker, 77% of Trump's voters and 76% of Clinton voters support the employee ownership model. Really quite a huge surprise. Now, there's no significant differences by gender, race, or union status. Interesting, huh? Now, where is there a big difference? We were so surprised. Doug Cruz, my colleague at Rutgers, and I were crunching these numbers a few weeks ago. We were surprised. Workers with incomes below $30,000, especially workers with incomes below $15,000, whether they are Republican or Democratic, or whether they are conservatives or liberals, they prefer the state ownership option. Let me be clear. A large percentage of Republican voters making below $30,000 prefer the state ownership model.
What is that model? State ownership?
The companies would be state-owned. Okay.
All companies would be state-owned.
Yeah, that's the model they prefer.
Okay.
So, you know, if you don't have a lot of money, you probably prefer the security of the state, okay? Now, if offered two jobs, one with employee ownership and profit sharing, one without, same benefits, same pay, 61% of adult workers say they would choose the shares job. If they were offered consumer buying choice, 40% would purchase from the employee ownership firm, only 8% would not. The rest would be neutral. Now, all this really indicates is that there is sort of fertile ground if you wanted to do policy on the shares concept. A thin layer of it is in a lot of companies, okay? And the public is generally friendly to the idea, and it's not a big partisan issue in the mind of the public. So what are your policy options? So 3 points here. There are many robust capital share policy options that are bipartisan. I can think also of 1,000 that are super partisan and would really upset everybody on both sides of the spectrum. But let's focus on the bipartisan ones. These have not been implemented, I think, because of the big lie in our labor economy. And the big lie is that real wage growth and mechanisms to dramatically increase it could happen and could rapidly undo economic inequality. My colleagues, this was a big major lie of President Obama's administration. It was a big major lie of President George W. Bush's administration. And it is a big, be careful, Joseph, fib of the current administration. I don't want to be on Twitter tomorrow morning. Regarding capital shares, there are sectoral coordination, plain favorites, wage substitution, and risk problems to problem solve if we want to create a policy around this. Comment very briefly on all of these. Sectoral, one of the problems with creating capital shares for a broad amount of the population is one size doesn't fit all, okay? There's a lot of grants of restricted stock happening in the 3,300 stock market companies. There's a lot of stock options happening in the Silicon Valley, high tech, and the startup sector. There's a lot of ESOPs in manufacturing. There's a lot of profit sharing in family-owned businesses. You have to legislate and regulate all forms of shares. So that's the sectoral problem. The coordination problem that I've studied very carefully is that there's no place in the entire federal government that coordinates the policy on all of these things, okay? It's really weird. Some are part of ERISA, some are not part of ERISA, some are under Treasury, some are under Labor. It's a total mess. So you see very, very weird things happening at the policy level. And we have a book called The Citizen Share, which is a history of policy, Yale University Press. And we examine all of these like very odd things that happen. You know, policy mistakes where you just throw away $1 billion in tax expenditures because you never coordinated the policies. There's a plain favorites issue. Everybody likes to have their favorite of shares, okay? So you have the ESOP proponents, the cash profit sharing proponents, the big tech companies, they want to talk about RSUs. You need to be able to get a coordinated policy on shares, okay? Next thing, there's wage substitution. We are very concerned that there would be wage substitution. We do not, strangely enough, find much evidence about wage substitution in many of these plans. And I can't go into it in detail, but I'm happy to send the papers. And then there's a risk problem. Yeah, we don't want to encourage a policy that's Enron, where the workers are pushed and manipulated and restricted to buy company stock in their 401k plan or in any purchase plans. So the conclusion of our book was that for the risk problem, let's just make a big compromise. All grants of all equity participation, employee ownership plans should be in the form of grants. Yes, possible to lose stock that you got from a grant, but you're not buying it with your own wage income, with your bread money, with your retirement money. And also, it probably makes a sense to combine tax incentives for cash profit sharing and equity participation. We all know cash profit sharing is less risky.
There would be grants as in excluding what? What are you excluding from that?
I would exclude the ability of workers to purchase stock in their 401k plan.
Really?
Or to purchase stock in other plans from their employer, unless there were extremely deep discounts which would make them look like grants.
So you would not allow employees to purchase at the market rate or whatever?
No.
Or
no.
even at a subsidized
No,
rate?
all of the evidence from the 1929 crash, the 2007-8 crash suggests that that's just not a good policy, not a good policy for workers. And another issue on the
you
risk
would
issue.
bar it, or you wouldn't allow it as a tax deduction?
No, I would bar it.
Oh.
I would bar it. Too many
Okay.
workers have been hurt
Okay.
by being forced to purchase their company stock. So I know this is an issue. A lot of people say, well, can't we find sort of another way? Sorry, folks. Equity participation in the market and in equity ownership is a big part of wealth and wealth accumulation in the United States. If we say that workers are average people are not good enough to participate in this equity, then we're condemning them to a life of feudalism and flat inflation-adjusted wages. So we got to find a middle point where we kind of try to reduce the risk as much as possible, but provide the opportunity. I'm happy to fight about that with anybody. Okay, so now I'm going to end with 7.
Here I thought you were going to be the defender of capitalism. I'm less sure now.
Well,
That's the joke.
we'll talk later.
Okay.
With 7 high-impact policies. So basically, if you want to have a significant impact on economic inequality at the workplace, there are 7 things you could do, but you have to do them all together. Because as I said, there's this coordination and sectoral issue. If you just go and you try to tell a whole story about cash profit sharing and make that sound really dramatic and good, that's not going to get all this done. So here they are. First, cash profit sharing tax credit and related regulatory changes for all workers. This is essentially the tax credit that a number of us, including your professor here, David Kamen, helped to create for Secretary Clinton's campaign. Existing tax incentives for each format. Employee stock purchase plans, restricted stock plans, ESOP, stock options, they need to be expanded and coordinated. Thirdly, revise the current administration's tax cut by lower the corporate tax rate only for companies that have broad-based equity participation and profit-sharing plans. This one is big. Next, condition the $1 trillion of corporate tax subsidies, corporate socialism, as Senator Sanders said yesterday, and tax expenditures on having a broad-based profit sharing and employee ownership plan. Wait a minute, why should $1 trillion of our money be going to corporations that do things to concentrate wealth? Huh? No, that would not be encouraged, okay? So you want to do accelerated depreciation, you have a broad-based profit-sharing plan or equity participation plan. There it is. Federal defense, non-defense procurement condition on broad-based share plans. The private equity carried interest tax incentive conditions on having a broad-based profit-sharing or equity participation plan for your actual, real, middle-class workers in your portfolio companies. And lastly, meaningful progressive reductions in the tax taking on workers who receive equity and profit-sharing plans. So you got the janitor at Google who's getting RSUs. Let's tax her less on that reception. Okay, going to end and tell you that there are also tens of millions of citizens who are not workers in for-profit enterprises. And this is where, yes, we need to figure out a way to finance state versions of the Alaska Permanent Fund to pay dividends to these citizens. I have a lot of ideas on this, but I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Good job, Dave. Very great. All right, we're gonna have the panel comment on each other after all the presentations. Our next presenter is Robert J. Kovachev. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Rob is from the Norton Rose Law Firm. Very much appreciate his coming. And he'll be discussing the merits of a robot tax. So I assume this is a tax on companies using AI, right?
Maybe
Okay.
actual tax on robots.
Or on the robots themselves. Okay.
February 2017, Bill Gates gave an interview to Quartz Magazine. And in that interview, he said, you know, these robots are coming and they're going to take everybody's jobs. So what we ought to do is we ought to tax those robots, take the proceeds, and then use them to help the displaced workers. That's really the first time in the public consciousness that the idea of a robot tax really came to the fore. So if we're looking at a lot of the proposals and the things that we talked about in this panel and the panel this morning, there are a lot of creative ideas. There's always a question, how are you going to pay for it? And what we're looking at with the rise of automation, AI, and robotics is a perfect storm from a tax revenue perspective. On the one hand, you're going to have job displacement. That means a lot more people are going to need social services. That costs money, tax money. At the same time, if you look at where tax revenues come from, it comes from human labor. In OECD countries, majority of the tax revenue comes from income taxes or payroll taxes. In the US, it's closer to 80%, since we don't have a VAT. So you're looking at a tax base which is shrinking at exactly the same time when the need for government intervention and government funds is increasing. We need to make up that stopgap somehow. And I think the robot tax concept is an idea to try and get a way to reach that solution. I'm calling it a robot tax because that's kind of what everyone talks about. It creates a really nice mental image of the Terminator having to go and fill out tax returns. If you look at the actual proposals that are made, it's not just about physical robots. It's also about AI. It's also about automation in general. The key denominator is some technology that takes jobs away from humans. If you look at all the robot tax proposals, either the ones that have been talked about by politicians or Bill Gates, or ones that have actually been boiled down to statutory text, that's what it is. It's always about going after the technologies that are taking away jobs from people. So how do you do this? There's a fundamental problem with anything you're going to call a robot tax. Robots don't pay taxes. They don't have money. They can't really pay these taxes. So anytime you talk about a robot tax, we are talking about some sort of artificial mechanism by which people are going to be paying it. And it could be people paying it as in the people that own the businesses that employ the robots. It could be the people that are consumers that are, that are consuming goods and services that have been produced by automation or robots. No matter how you look at it, the robot tax is really a tax on us collectively, on people, because some person, some human ultimately will have to pay it. Even if it's a corporate tax, ultimately there will be a human agent behind it. So, putting aside the kind of fanciful ideas of the Terminator filling out tax returns, really a robot tax is a tax on people that either consume goods made by automation or that own those processes. So there are a lot of problems. I'm a tax lawyer, so I'm coming at this from a tax law perspective. You will find a big enthusiasm gap between people in the tech industry and other industries and tax lawyers about how great a robot tax is. There's a lot of skepticism in the tax community, especially in this country, about whether it works. And there are a couple of reasons why, which I want to get into. The first one, which was alluded to in the first panel this morning, what's a robot? And there are lots of discussion about that. There are technical definitions, but what is a taxable robot is going to be something that has to be answered. We'll have to boil it down to statutory text that someone's going to have to interpret. It's not easy. A great example, which I like to refer to, is actually a Chuck E. Cheese case. It's something that actually came up in Maryland. Maryland used to have something called a performer's tax. If you had someone that was, you had an establishment and there was somebody performing, then you would have to assess a performer's tax on all the proceeds from the restaurant or whatever. Chuck E. Cheese opened 3 locations in Maryland. And the Maryland treasurer came in and said, wait a minute, I see that animatronic mouse up there with his friends. If you've been to Chuck E. Cheese, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And basically the setup is you go there, your kids play games, and you eat this cardboard thing that resembles pizza, and then there's Chuck E. Cheese and his friends, which are animatronics, basically putting on a show. Maryland's position was, wait, they're performers. So so Chuck E. Cheese owes performance tax. It actually went up to the Court of Appeals, which said no. And the reason they said no is, well, there's nothing in the statute that says what a performer is or isn't in terms of whether it's a human or a machine. But if you look at Chuck E. Cheese up there, he's basically like a jukebox. He can't decide what to play. He can't decide how to play it. He can't make mistakes. He can't be, have aspects of virtuosity. So we're really talking about mechanical reproduction. So that's not a performer. So Chuck E. Cheese didn't have to pay tax, which is wonderful for them. But what if you do have, in the future, an animatronic mouse that writes its own music, that is able to choose what it wants to perform, how it wants to perform it, and when, and can do basically anything that a human performer can do? How are you going to parse that one out? So when you're thinking about what's a robot in terms of taxing, that's the kind of issue which judges and legislators, everyone involved in tax law will have to face. So that is a fundamental issue. A couple of other issues that that come up with are the effects on innovation. One of the issues that proponents of robot tax emphasize, and this matters a lot here because this is the conference about the mitigation of effect on workers, is we want to save jobs. And this tax is necessary to save jobs. A lot of the people that are proponents talk about things like, well, this is just like a tax on pollution. So we tax, or a sin tax on alcohol or tobacco. There's something going on that we want to discourage, and this tax is how we get there, and it doesn't really matter about the details as long as we discourage it. Well, wait a minute. What if innovation in this area is good? What if we actually want to have robots that perform functions? What if we want to have a robot surgeon that that's able to perform medical procedure without an invasive procedure of many hours with lots of people who may make mistakes? There are a lot of areas where I think it's easy to say AI, automation, and robotics, good. And I think we need to step back a little bit and think about, do we really want to impose a tax just to punish people that are trying to engage in those activities, or that will need to use those activities? So if you look at all these, kind of tax policy or technical reasons why it doesn't work, I think that there are, here's the problem. Robots may not be taxed, they also don't.
Just limit on what you can do.
And they don't make campaign contributions.
I know, it's kind of logical.
So what you may see in the next recession, where there are job losses, they will be blamed on automation, robotics, AI. And it will be very popular to point at the robot that can't vote as opposed to my campaign, contributors that, that do. So I think that even though from a tax perspective, it's not a great idea, you will see these proposals come up.
Rob, if I could just cut in for a moment. Do we ordinarily tax investment, capital investment, that act? I know we have limits on deductions for the value of that investment, but is that a taxable event ordinarily?
No, and that's actually a good point. One of the features, especially in the United States, about the tax system is it favors robotics as opposed to hiring fewer workers. You hire someone, you have to pay payroll tax. The employer pays it, the employee pays it. If I buy a robot, not only do I have to pay a tax to the federal government anyway, to buy it, I get a tax deduction. Under the old law, you would get to depreciate that over a number of years. Under the tax reform law that just passed a couple of years ago, I can write off the whole thing. And there are a lot of other tax benefits that come along with automation. So if you're an employer and you're trying to make this decision from a tax perspective, do I hire 10 workers and take on the payroll tax liabilities and so forth? Or do I buy a robot, take the tax deduction, and not have to worry about the payroll tax?
If I could just follow up my question, do we tax the hiring of an individual? We may tax their wages, presumably for their own benefit, workers' comp or unemployment comp, but we don't tax the act of hiring people, do we? Ordinarily?
No, but the act of paying them, which is ordinarily
But it's based on their
Yes.
income. But it's based on their income.
It is based on usually on W-2 wages.
Yeah, based on income. Yeah.
That's right. Which again, robots don't earn income, so
Not yet.
that taxes it.
Not yet.
So a couple of real-world examples that have come up.
Analogies are good.
One
just so
comes
far.
from Geneva. And this is an area, for some reason, the Geneva City Council became fixated about automated supermarket cashiers. I don't know why. But, they felt that this was an urgent public policy, crisis that needed to be averted. So it was proposed that there be a tax on automated cashiers. And how they structured this tax was really fascinating. They said every supermarket that has one of these machines has to pay 10,000 Swiss francs every month. That's about almost $10,000 every month for having those machines. I'm going to take those proceeds, 30% of them I'm going to put in a special foundation, which is going to be dedicated to supporting displaced workers. The other 70%, I'm going to give the subsidy to all those supermarkets that did not install any automated workers. Where they're going with this is kind of clear. This is not about tax policy. This is really about saving supermarket cashier jobs. So when you're looking at the type of proposals that are being made, a lot of them are going to be this kind of, there's an interest group. I want to do something to help save those jobs. I'm going to do this to save those jobs. In some instances, that there may be merit to that. In other instances, there's a danger of capture by special interests. For any particular job that neither addresses the problems of automation from a tax perspective, nor really help the economy at large. So, what if there's going to be a robot tax anyway? How are you going to do it? First off, there are a lot of tax deductions, credits, other benefits that tend, even though they're facially neutral, they tend to favor employers that use automation instead of what if you could condition or limit the ability to take those deductions based on some measure of W-2 wages or something else that indicates, yes, we're hiring people. And as a result, you can take advantage of this deduction, whereas if you're gone fully automated, you can't use that deduction anymore, or it's reduced. That's one possibility. Another possibility is to do rifle shots in certain areas where there are large numbers of jobs, truck drivers being one that comes to mind, because as soon as there's automated technology, there are going to be millions of people who are truck drivers who are going to be out of a job. If you're going to do either of those, though, what makes the most sense is for it to be temporary. Because if you're looking at the dislocations, which are real, and the tax effects of those, they're not going to last forever. The economy will adjust. The point is to make that adjustment easier, not to punish innovation and break the looms like the Luddites. So if you're looking at a robot tax and how you're actually going to implement it, those are some features which you need to consider. But the concept of robot tax is out there, and I think that you will see in the future when there's a recession or something, people talking about, well, let's tax the robots. And I hope I've convinced you that since robots don't actually pay taxes yet, there's a little bit more involved than Terminator filling out his tax returns.
Thank you, Rob. Very interesting. All right, we're going to turn now, I believe, to the universal basic income proposal. And our speaker is Albert Wenger from a consultant operation called Union Square Ventures. And I asked Al, is it Albert?
Albert.
I asked Albert if he could see Union Square from his window. He says, just a little. So it passes the Russia test.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this audience about universal basic income. We're not a consulting firm. I am, in fact, one of those venture capitalists who invest in automation.
Sorry, I apologize.
Among our portfolio are companies that automate things from image recognition all the way to medical diagnosis. I've also had an intellectual interest in automation going back to my undergraduate thesis 30 years ago, which was on automated trading. Long before that was a big thing. Very few people in this room are unfamiliar with UBI, Universal Basic Income, but just in case there are, it's essentially an idea to give every citizen, every adult citizen, something like $1,000 a month, and children less than that. This idea in the US has quite a long intellectual history. It goes back to an essay by Thomas Paine on agrarian justice from 1795. And over the years, the proponents in the US have included people from all across the political and ideological spectrum, including Milton Friedman and Martin Luther King. If I've done my math correctly, the first annual NYU Labor Conference would have been in 1947.
Right.
Something that now looking back, we can recognize as the beginning of the golden era of the industrial age. What ensued were some 30 to 40 years of growth that was split very evenly between capital and labor. Looking back now, however, the last 20-some years, we have experienced what's now known as the Great Decoupling, which is we've had growth, but the benefits have accumulated largely to capital and not to labor. This is largely due to the twin effects of automation and globalization. So given this effect of automation on labor, it's not surprising that this section of the conference has the word mitigation in its title. And UBI is often positioned sort of defensively. It's the, hey, you're going to lose your job, but here's some money. And I think this framing is deeply problematic. At best, it makes UBI seem like another welfare policy. But at worst, it kind of has a ring of opium for the people to it, a way of keeping the working population docile while capitalists make more money. So how then should we think about UBI? I have a book, you can read it online, it's called World After Capital, you can read it for free. I refer to it as economic freedom. Why? Because UBI massively increases individual freedoms. And it does so by providing a walkaway option. It's a walk-away option from a bad job, a walk-away option from a bad spouse, a walk-away option from a bad city. And as such, one of the things it does, it tremendously increases bargaining power in the work market. Something like 40% of all US citizens live more or less paycheck to paycheck. As a result, they have zero bargaining power in the work market as it exists today. But at its most fundamental, what UBI does is it makes people free as to how they choose to allocate their time. It doesn't prevent them from working. If they want to work and make more money, UBI doesn't stop that one bit. But if they want to instead spend more time with family or friends, or spend time on art or science or the environment or any of the million other things that we as humans do outside of the labor market, they can now freely choose to do so. There's another crucial distinction between the sort of defensive mitigation framing of UBI and the kind of offensive freedom framing that I prefer. The former implies that we're basically stuck in the industrial age, whereas the latter carries with it at least a hint or a hope that we can get into a new age, something I call in my book the knowledge age. To me, the defining characteristic of the industrial age isn't industry as in manufacturing. The defining characteristic is this sort of job loop, where people sell their labor and they get an income and they use that income to buy stuff, and that stuff, goods and services, is also made by other people who have sold their labor. Now, if we think about it this way, then if you go back to 1780, about 90% of employment was in agriculture. Today, that is sub 3%. And many times when people say this, they say it and say, look, we took these jobs and we automated them and we replaced them with other jobs. And so we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to take the existing jobs, we're going to automate them and replace them with new jobs. To me, this is a sort of uninspired, lack of imagination reading of this extraordinary human accomplishment. What we've really accomplished is that we've taken something that occupied 90% of human attention just to get us fed, and we've reduced it to kind of an afterthought. So what occupies the bulk of our attention today? Well, it is that job loop. It is paid labor. Now, I believe that if we enable automation to its fullest extent that's now possible, then maybe 50 to 100 years from now, we can look back and we can say, wow, look at it, 80% of all of our attention was tied up in this thing where we were making money and spending it and making money and spending it, and now that's maybe whatever, sub 20%, sub 10%. I should add that I think this is a crucial moment in time that we actually work on freeing up attention. Why? Because the market-based system has been extraordinarily successful. I'm a huge fan of markets. But because it's been successful, it has solved many of the problems that it can solve. And as a result, the problems that have now floated to the top are the very problems that the market-based system cannot solve. And it cannot solve them because there are not prices for the allocation of attention to some of the most important issues. There is no prize for people in this room individually finding their purpose in life. You're not going to allocate attention to that based on a price mechanism. There is no prize for avoiding human extinction from climate change. It's too big an event. There's no amount of price that will get us to allocate enough attention to that. Same goes for things like asteroid strikes. So in this view, then, UBI is a central pillar of kind of a new social contract, and one that enables the transition out of the industrial age into this knowledge age. Now, there are many objections to UBI. Most of these, such as people are just going to spend it on drugs, or there's going to be an immediate implosion in the supply of labor, are readily dismissed by the available evidence from trials, going all the way back to the Mincome experiment in 1970, and all the way to the most recent experiments run in Kenya by Gift Directly. There's also other indirect evidence that contradicts those assertions, such as what actually happened on Indian reservations with casino money. So I'm therefore only going to focus on two objections. One of them is practical, and one of them is philosophical. The practical objection is that UBI is not affordable, that we don't have enough money to pay for it. Almost every analysis that I've ever read that has come to this conclusion makes two big mistakes. The first mistake is that it looks at gross expenses, and the second mistake is that it only considers fiscal ways of implementing a UBI. In the US, the gross expense of a UBI would be something on the order of $3.3 trillion. That's roughly the same as the entire federal revenue base. Net expenses, however, would be significantly smaller. What do I mean by net expenses? If you're going to introduce a UBI, you also need to change the tax system. And you need to start taxing first dollar earned. You may vaguely recall Mitt Romney made a remark once about 47% that may or may not have sunk his campaign. And that was a remark about the percentage of population doesn't pay federal income tax. Now, if you switch to a first dollar income taxed, everybody starts paying tax. Some calculations that if we did a 35% flat tax rate, and we eliminated some differences, some deductions that largely go to fairly wealthy people, and we also started taxing capital gains, all sources of income the same. So 35% flat tax rate on all income. The net expense for UBI shrinks down to $1.5 trillion. By the way, this is a completely static calculation. This doesn't assume any expansion in economic activity. The Roosevelt Institute has estimated that implementing a UBI would expand the size of the economy by $2 trillion, which would, of course, also expand the tax base. Now, $1.5 trillion is still a lot of money, so how do we get further down? Well, once we have a UBI, or as we ramp into a UBI, you could eliminate things like food stamps and TANF, and you could significantly modify Social Security. That would give you, all of that together would give you about $500 billion. For the remaining $1 trillion, there's a lot of different proposals floating around. Those include a carbon tax, financial transaction tax, a VAT. That's the proposal from Andrew Yang, who is one of the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates who's actually running on the UBI platform. So some combination of those could get you to $1 trillion. One of the things this all together doesn't touch, and something that I'm quite partial to, is the idea that we could actually implement some of this through the money supply instead. That's an idea that's been popular with economists from the Austrian school, also been popular with Milton Friedman, whom I mentioned earlier was a UBI advocate. Since the 2008 financial crisis, we have on average created $500 billion of new money every year. And because we have a fractional reserve banking system, it's the commercial banks that get to decide where that money goes, which basically means that a wealthy person like myself can get a mortgage for a second, third home, whatever. We could simply give that money into UBI accounts for citizens, and the money would still enter the economy. It would be the same amount of money. It would just enter it very equally among everybody. Now, at the $500 billion level, that pays for a lot, not all of UBI, but it would clearly not be inflationary because we've been putting $500 billion into the economy and it hasn't been inflationary. I believe we could actually do more than that. We could do more than that if we also had a system of demurrage to go along with it. Demurrage is a way of removing money back from the economy. The whole point of all of this is, no matter how you look at it, this is something that's eminently affordable. And this shouldn't come as a total surprise because even at the gross expense level of $3.3 trillion, it's only about 15% of GDP. And at the net level of $1.5 trillion, it's less than 10%. And at the, once you've adjusted TANF and Social Security and so forth, it's like 5% of GDP. So we're talking about something that's 5% of GDP that could get us a UBI. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's actually doable. Now let me get on briefly to the philosophical objection. The philosophical objection is the claim that by removing the need to work in order to earn a living, we're actually taking away people's purpose in life. And this is a very strongly held view today by many, and a strong objection to UBI. But if you went back in time to the Middle Ages or to antiquity, and you ask people about purpose, they wouldn't say your purpose is to have a paid job. They would say something like it's to follow the commandments of your religion, or to be a good citizen in your community, or maybe to be a philosopher. So why is it so difficult for us today to disentangle purpose from a paid job? Well, it's difficult because we spent the last 200 years telling people that that's what their purpose is. And one way to see that is to just look at our education system. Literally everything we do in education is so you can get a job. Why are people so excited about STEM education today? It's not because we have difficult scientific problems to solve. It's because people say, well, get a STEM education so you can get a job. So we have deeply, deeply bought into this, and it's going to take us some time to work our way out of it. And one of the things we're going to need to do that is we're going to need to rethink how education works, because the current educational system, we built it coincident with the industrial age. At this point, you might well conclude that I'm crazy because I want to introduce a UBI, I want to change the tax code substantially, I want to switch how we do banking, I want to change the education system. Any one of these seems impossible, so like how we do all of them. And I just want to point something out. We have changed everything about how humanity lives twice already. So basically, for millions of years, our ancestors were foragers. 250,000 years of that as Homo sapiens, we were foragers. And then we invented agriculture only about 10,000 years ago, and we changed everything about how humanity lives. We went from being migratory to being sedentary. We went from living in these flat tribes to living in these super hierarchical societies. We went from being promiscuous to being monogamous-ish. We went from having animistic religions to having theistic religions. Changed everything. And then a couple hundred years ago, we changed everything yet again. When we went from the agrarian age to the industrial age, we went from living in the country to living in the city, from large extended families to nuclear families to no families. We went from lots of commons to lots of private property, including private intellectual property. And we changed religion again. We went from great chain of being theology to the Protestant work ethic. So the real answer is we've actually changed everything twice already. And why did we do so? We did so because each time there was a massive change in what humans were capable of doing. 10,000 years ago, with agriculture, we gave ourselves artificial food. I don't mean artificial food as in chemistry, but food that we made grow. It wasn't growing by itself. And then 200 years ago, we gave ourselves artificial power. Power that wasn't coming from our muscles, but that was coming from machines. And now, we can give ourselves artificial intelligence. And for us to think that we're not going to have to change everything, for us to think that this is a matter of some incremental changes, I would posit that that is the mistaken view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Clifford Wallace. You know, there are very many ways of reaching Godhead. One is to be a former student of mine, which Cliff is not. A second is to be a client of mine, which Cliff is not. A third is to be a funder of my activities, which Cliff is not. And the fourth is to be a co-author. I'm very proud of the piece that Cliff and I are going to be publishing in the Harvard Journal on legislation on equitable healthcare savings accounts. Cliff now is going to turn his attention to the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which, like ESOPs, has the advantage of being supported in a bipartisan fashion. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Oh, that was short-lived. All right, let's see here.
See, we may be the global law school, as our dean likes to say, but we have 19th century technology, as far as I can tell.
I don't know what just happened with that.
What's the problem? Alice, Tori, is our tech person still here? Do you know?
All right, well, I'll just talk. I had a dazzling
You did.
graphical display, so assume amazing stuff. Yeah. Here, just on, I think it's on this one. Yeah. Okay, so,
You want to sit here?
sure.
Sit here. Sorry about this.
So, dialing back a little bit from the idea of basic income and building on some of what was discussed in the morning session, I want to talk about a different version of the labor market challenges that the sort of coming of AI and robots might get us to, and that's that jobs don't disappear, but we have a proliferation of jobs that go along with robots and AI that are just worse than the jobs we hope for and expect today. So you have low-paying jobs with no chance of advancement. That's sort of the depressing possibility. So this could put pressure on the various labor subsidies that we already have in the U.S., and that would demand a kind of different version of a response that's not focused on people not working, but is focused on supporting people who are working in a different way. So the less dramatic alternative sort of policy solution I want to talk about today is what I call the living wage earned income tax credit. So it's a version of the earned income tax credit, or EITC, that is meant to be an ongoing wage subsidy that supports these potentially worse jobs. So in contrast to the EITC today, which I'll talk about, it's not this sort of bootstrappy, help you start to ascend the socioeconomic ladder injection. It's something that many people would live with as part of their wage structure and how they support themselves and their families. If you imagine if you imagine, I guess, my prototypical job that I would now be pointing to a picture of is you have these people in Amazon warehouses. There are very few people in the warehouses compared to what were, I guess, in shipping facilities before, and you have all these robots running around. There's a small number of people at the warehouses who control the robots with metal sticks. So when a robot gets off course, you come in with a stick and you sort of push it to the right spot, and then it can keep going. These Amazon workers, they check in with cards. They have very strict rules for when they can come and leave and how much they have to get done while they're there. And it's all overseen by sort of automated stuff. So there's not even within this facility a hierarchy where you could work on the floor for a while and then get up to the sort of middle management and maybe, go to the home office eventually. It's just flat. You're there with the stick. So that's the sort of long-term work situation that a living wage EITC is meant to address. So first, let me give some background on the existing EITC. And I'll try not to belabor this, recognizing now when it's sort of a tax conference, this is when people get interested, like, okay, what are the details? Like, let's get into Section 32, but I'll try to resist that, and if I'm not, like, poke me.
I will.
So the credit is calculated based on a few different inputs. First, how many children are in the tax-paying unit? The credit's more generous for people with more children. Second and key, how much income is earned, which is called the earned income amount, up to a set level. The statute then provides a credit percentage so that for every dollar earned up to that set level, the worker is subsidized a certain amount. So for a family with one child, the subsidy amount is 34%. For a worker with no children, it's 7.65%. With 3 or more children, it's 45%. So it's sort of adjusted based on family size. There's then a maximum credit amount, and then something called the threshold phase-out amount, which is where the credit begins to go down. It's reduced until you reach a certain level of income. The EITC was originally enacted in 1975 as a temporary provision in response to the ongoing recession at that time. It was made permanent in 1978. It was then expanded in 1986, 1990, 1993, 2001, 2009 by both Democratic and Republican administrations, so it's had generally bipartisan support. Today, it's the largest cash transfer program to low-income households. It provides about $70 billion a year to 27 million households. That's about $2,500 per filer, per taxpayer. Now, sort of in response to, or adding on to the sort of Mitt Romney 47% point, a lot of these people, even when they're receiving the refundable version of the tax credit, they still have tax liability. They have payroll tax liability, they pay sales tax, they bear the burden of property tax through their rent payments. So someone receiving a refundable earned income tax credit is not necessarily, even if they are literally getting money back from the government, ta-da, they are not necessarily avoiding all tax liability. The EITC lifts about 8 million people a year out of poverty, and 97% of the benefits are paid to families without children. Families with children. So now you get to see that it was not quite as dazzling as I promised. Here's the stick. That's the person with the stick. This is the possibility of robots doing lawyer jobs. That was going to be very bad. Can anyone name this reference? RoboCop, yeah, this is the RoboCop doling out justice and killing a boardroom full of people. Very bad. The alternative is, the real alternative that we're dealing with that came up some over lunch is, AI doing document review and sort of, that's a real version of AI in the legal industry. Okay, current EITC, I want to show you one picture here. So we talked about this. This is what the EITC structure looks like. So it's this trapezoid, and when I talk about playing around with the parameters, we'll just be changing the shape of the trapezoid. So you can make it be steeper at the start, so more of a work incentive initially. You can make it last longer on the plateau region. You can make it phase out in a different way. But this example shows how it works for a single parent with one child. So the credit phases in up until income reaches $10,300. At that point, the taxpayer receives an EITC of $3,526. That's for 2019. And then once his or her income gets to $19,030, it starts to phase out. So what are some issues with the existing EITC? One is that on the phase out, the reduction in the credit acts like an additional marginal tax. So you have someone now who earns $20,000 who is subject to a marginal tax rate of 10 or 15%, including regular income tax and maybe state income tax, and an additional marginal rate of 15.98% because they're losing that amount of credit for each dollar that they earn. So suddenly you have people with very high marginal rates at very low incomes, which is arguably not great. Second, there are no cost of living adjustments. So the one parent, one child household gets the same $3,500 EITC, whether they live in New York City or South Carolina. And $3,500 means a lot. It means very different things in those two places. Third, there is no longer any option for income smoothing with the EITC. The only way to receive it is when you file your tax return in April following the taxable year. There was, until 2011, a way to receive advanced tax credits that were paid, sort of adjusted your payroll, but that was eliminated by Congress out of concerns about fraud, which the EITC is a very heavily policed area in tax enforcement, which it is not necessarily logical, but it's easy to enforce. So that's why we end up with that. Last, the EITC amount, although it adjusts for number of children, is not very well adjusted for family characteristics overall. So the plateau is extended for married households that have two potential workers, and the amount of the EITC goes up until you reach 3 children, but there's not an increase in EITC for more than 3 children. There's no sort of attempt to to calibrate between single parents and married parents. So it's sort of, you end up with some funny incentives at the margins because of that. Now, in contrast, if you think about the federal poverty guidelines, they are adjusted to persons in the household. So we have this measure of, how much does a household of 5 people need to subsist as compared to 4 or 6, but this is not, even this level of fine tuning does not exist in EITC policy. So here is my living wage EITC concept, which is basically an adjustment to how we think about, or how the current EITC works. The current EITC, most of the benefits go to households in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. Most of those families only receive the EITC for 1 or 2 years at a time. So what I'm talking about with the living wage EITC is a version that extends much further up the income range into the second quintile and middle quintile, and that is that we would expect, we as policymakers would expect families to receive year after year. So they're not meant to grow out of this EITC. So input is still the same earned income amount. That's sort of the basic bread and butter. That would be accompanied or sort of put together with a longer plateau. So you get to the top range of the EITC credit, and then there's a long plateau and a much longer phase out, or maybe even start phasing out immediately, but at a very slow rate. So we get people up to a living wage quickly, and then we keep that support there through a long range of as their income continues to increase. The credit amount would track to the federal poverty guidelines, so adjust for family size, but also to cost of living. So you would have to make it locally adjusted. And there's 2 versions of how to think about doing that I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, it should be paid throughout the year so that it has this income smoothing function, so that it's a reliable source of income that households can make use of for ongoing needs, as opposed to kind of a bonus to pull them, to like pull a family out of poverty once a year. That's sort of that's the structure that EITC has taken. Now, the ACA premium subsidy credits, they actually do this very effectively. There's a mechanism where those credits are paid throughout the year that allows people to buy health insurance with them throughout the year. And that has not been a source of fraud, even in the sort of boogeyman version of sources of fraud.
Cliff, do you have cost estimates on?
I'm going to reference cost estimates, but I feel nicely anchored by the 3.5 trillion, so this will feel very affordable.
That sets a very, very low bar for us.
Yeah. Okay, so complications. The devil's in the details. With where exactly you set these subsidies, we could argue a lot about that. One sort of twist is the, I guess, truck driver question. Would you make this kind of subsidy available to all workers, or would you limit it to specific sectors where you know the where you know the Amazon worker is going to be pushing the stick in the factory, in the warehouse? And then the third possible twist is, should this be something that's administered at the national level, or is it better done locally? And you have obviously this long history of local wage ordinances. I want to talk about very quickly the comparison with why wouldn't you just do this with a minimum wage? But minimum wages do have the advantage of, when they're enacted locally, they sort of reflect local cost structures and sensibilities in various ways. So just a comparison to minimum wage limitations. Obviously, the minimum wage makes increases the direct cost of labor, so will on the margin push employment to cheaper places, which could be a problem for a national policy. If you think about minimum wages as a tax imposed on the employer and paid to the employee, then really a minimum wage is a tax with a very small base. So the EITC is a broader base tax that uses the money in the same way to support employment, but it's based on our existing tax structure or some new tax like a VAT or something else, but on a broad base instead of targeting the employers who you are also relying on to do the hiring.
Cliff, can this be viewed as a subsidy of low-wage employers? Unlike the minimum wage, it's the flip side of the tax on employment.
Right, exactly. So if a minimum wage if a minimum wage imposes the tax on the employer who you want to do the low wage hiring, this is expanding the base, so we're taxing other people to fund or to support lower wages.
The low-wage employer.
Exactly.
It's a big problem.
Third, the option, the possibility of targeting. So minimum wage laws have a good expressive function. They say, you know, we value work at this minimum level, and that's important. But there's a lot of work out there showing who benefits from minimum wage laws and living wage laws, and it's not well targeted to low-income workers or even to workers who are sort of middle income but struggling on the margins. It's kind of a blunt instrument because you think about a minimum wage law applies to every hour worked in the jurisdiction. EITC allows for much better targeting by accounting for characteristics of who is receiving the subsidy, and that's true even in the basic version of EITC that exists today. Limitations. Cost could be quite expensive. I did not put numbers to that. Second limitation, these are major. The EITC does not create jobs. So this is relying on a world where there are jobs. They just aren't good enough. So it's not, maybe you could see it as a sort of bridge the gap to our UBI future, but this is sort of addressing a different problem, and frankly, we may already have arrived at the place where that problem needs to be addressed, which is terminal, low-paying jobs without the possibility of advancement. So that's the living wage EITC idea. Here's a few places you can look for further information, and that's all I got.
Thank you very much. We've got some terrific presentations. We have one more presenter. He's a commentator, Larry Carey. Larry is a union-side lawyer with his own firm, Kane Carey, or Carey Kane. I think it's Carey Kane. He's a good friend. We're very active in the fight to keep alive the specialized high schools in New York City. Larry's the president also of the Brooklyn Tech Alumni Foundation. And you're going to comment on some of these proposals, right?
I am.
Good. And he's a member of the advisory board of the Labor Center here.
Tax policy, it really gets the room rolling.
Let's talk about this.
You know, I knew nothing about,
Living wage EITC. It's
let me back up. I'm a
Is that
labor
Das
lawyer.
Kapital? What is it?
Huh?
Is that Das Kapital you've wrote
No,
down?
I could have. That one I got rid of a long time ago. These are new books. I'm a union side labor lawyer. I have real-world limitations for understanding a lot of the stuff that our panelists did a very good job of presenting. I took one tax course, which was really surplusage because I had done my own taxes for 20 years before I took that tax course in law school, and I knew what I had to do. It was get publication 129, and that was the tax course. So I'm not an expert in tax policy. I had an undergraduate education in economics, so I have some limitations there as well. But as a union side labor lawyer, I have great skepticism about anything that talks about, giving people free money. I've spent 35 years trying to help unions squeeze more out of employers. It's very difficult. And as a society, I think it's more than difficult to do what we've talked about here today. I knew nothing about universal basic income, so I said, I'll buy a book. And being a union side lawyer, I bought Raising the Floor by Andy Stern, who's the former president of SEIU. He represented 2 million people. He's a big proponent of universal basic income. So I said, if nothing else, out of duty of loyalty, I should read his book. But I also realized I shouldn't rely completely on his view. So I let Amazon use its algorithm and pick 2 more books for me. If you don't know, they do it. They will pick for you what you want to read, I guess. And they also assign different prices to them depending on your purchase history and how much you're willing to pay. So I have no idea how much more I paid for these books, but what the hell. So the first book that Amazon's algorithm recommended had the great title, Give People Money.
I have that book too, which I haven't read.
That's a great title.
Yes, it is.
By Anne Lowry. She differs from Andy in the sense that she's half his age. Well, that's important. And she doesn't come out of the labor movement. She's a journalist, very intelligent, has a slightly different take on a lot of these things, and it was a different voice. And then, I don't know why, the algorithm picked for me Basic Income, which is a tome written by 2 European academics. Half of it is footnotes, so it's really quite well researched, and you can search through their points. It's an incredible intellectual history of the topic. Although it's mentioned here and there in the other 2 books, these folks really do, I would be surprised if they forgot anything to say about the last 1,000 years of intellectual history that relates to universal basic income. It's not as easy to read as the other 2, but it's worthwhile when you put the 3 of them together. What is universal basic income? Simple concept, really. They all agree it involves a periodic cash payment from the state to all adults that is unconnected to work, unconnected to the inability to work or the desire to work, and the entitlement being completely unconditional. By contrast, modern society, we have 2 ways of dealing with dislocations in our economy and problems of poverty. One is, and the dominant one is, social welfare programs, which are means tested. You have to either be poor enough or unemployed or something has befallen you. And you also have to be available to work in many of them, or willing to work. The other type of social insurance programs we have are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or Medicare really, where people pay into it. And because you participate in it, at the end of the day, you get a benefit from it. And those usually take advantage of the law of people dying. And as a result, you get a better benefit than you would get if you could save that money on your own. But they also actually, play a little bit with helping the poor of the folks who participate, so that if you make a lot of money, your Social Security benefit is not really going to be what you put into the system. If you make very little money, you'll get more out of the system than what you really put in. Although statistically, and this may have changed, but I doubt it, I should just point this out. If you are a black male in the United States, every dollar you put into Social Security does not go to a black male. It goes to everybody else. Statistically, because black males die so much earlier than everybody else, they don't, as a group, get a benefit from Social Security. They wind up subsidizing white people like me, which is an interesting concept. In any event, Stern's book is fundamentally founded on the notion that we are facing an Armageddon, that in rather quick time, one generation really, or maybe less, half of the jobs we currently do will not be here. And we won't have a job that's comparable to replace them. And so he is concerned that this will become such a stressor in our society that revolution could even be a possibility. And I'll quote just two brief paragraphs. If there are significantly fewer jobs and less work available in the future, how will people make a living, spend their time, and find purpose in their lives? Also, how can we keep the income gap from growing so vast that it erupts into social discord and upheaval? If you didn't understand what he was saying, he reinforces it later on. Technological unemployment threatens our economy and also our American way of life. An underclass of youth without hope and jobs is capable of becoming violent and spawning terrorists. Technological unemployment is a national security issue. So from his view, and he believes we're at an inflection point, meaning that this has happened. We don't even realize it at this point. The train has left the station, and we're all standing there wondering why we're not on board, because we have no idea what's going to happen. And so his view is this is happening, it has happened, it's inevitable, and it's going to be a disaster, quite honestly. And so his solution to that social problem is to support a universal basic income. Right? Because in his mind, that is the only way that we will be able to keep people alive with no job for them to do. And so he advocates for it throughout his entire book. Now, his proposal is $1,000 a month, which actually in all three books is echoed, and is echoed by our able presenter today, $1,000 a month. Doesn't matter whether the book was written 10 years, well, I should say 10, but 8 years ago or more current, $1,000 a month. And I think that's really due to the fact that that's a number that sort of sounds good to a lot of people, but it's not necessarily thought through very carefully, right? So Stern's proposal is $1,000 a month for all adults between 18 and 64. Anybody earning less on Social Security gets topped up to $1,000 a month. People earning more get topped down. I should say, should be cut out. He views this is such a necessary thing we have to undertake that we have to radically alter and eliminate social welfare, social insurance, and it will mean a restructuring of Social Security as well as an elimination potentially of Medicare and Medicaid and basically everything, almost everything else you can think of that we currently provide. Lowry is really not in agreement with Stern. She doesn't see Armageddon happening. She sees the major reason for UBI as being a mechanism for eliminating poverty and creating some form of social justice. She talks a lot about the stigma associated with being on welfare and that kind of thing, and UBI eliminates the stigma because everybody's entitled to it. But she does not believe there will be an Armageddon. And unlike Andy, who is somewhat concerned about workers, she says, quote, "The point is economies grow and workers survive, regardless of the pain and churn of technological dislocation. When manufacturing went from more than a quarter of American employment to just 10%, which is relatively recent, mass unemployment did not result, nor did it when agriculture went from employing 40% of the workforce to employing just 2% of the workforce." She's really coming from a much different place. Right, as I say, her argument is it will eliminate poverty, and her second major argument, which is also echoed by other authors, is it will eliminate the huge governmental bureaucracy we have created to provide Social Security and to provide SNAPs and to provide all these payments. I find it personally ironic that a policy which is intended to deal with the effects of unemployment is argued for by creating more unemployment, the elimination of basically, the majority of government workers in our society, which is a pretty large proportion of our society, right, instead of increasing public employment. Now, the last two authors, and I just don't speak Flemish, so I cannot pronounce the first name or the last name properly. Parges, you know, it's a P-A-R-I-J-S. Anybody can help me with that? But how is it? Okay, I'll take it. And Vanderboch, I assume it's a hard K or a hard G-H-T. Their view of UBI is that it is based on the expansion of human freedom. It's a very different approach. It's not we're going to have a terrible world in the future, we're not going to eliminate poverty per se, but we're going to expand freedom in our society. And we expand it because people will have the ability to do things which they cannot do because they don't get $1,000 a month. And there is some truth to this, just as there's truth to the idea that if nobody has a job and we don't have jobs for them, we're going to have to do something unless we round them up like in Soylent Green, you know, and feed them back to the people, which is what happens in Soylent Green, right? But their view of life, quote, it will promote, quote, a world of freedom, real freedom, not mere formal freedom, and for all, not just for the happy few, meaning the rich, right? And they talk about there are two alternatives to deal with the massive loss of jobs that will be occasioned by technology. And, you know, it's either UBI or it's going to be expand, you know, the government programs that we have, which they point out when they're means tested has the negative effect of creating dependency. If you go to work, you lose your benefit. So people tend to stay, or some people tend to stay, not working because they wish to preserve the benefit they're getting. Whereas UBI does not have that disability. You go to work, you don't go to work, you're free.
Who cares?
All right? Now, one point that these folks make that the others don't is a global UBI. Being European, I wouldn't even call them Flemish. Being European, they're very concerned about relations between countries. And so they argue for a global UBI as the only rational course of human history. And they talk about paying for that by auctioning off the right of corporations to expel carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but only to the extent that it is determined scientifically not to cause more climate change. I can hardly imagine what that debate would require in terms of calculating it. Now, while they talk about freedom, there are some limitations in their approach. For instance, an undocumented worker would not get UBI. Sort of an interesting concept, right? The person comes here, but they have no legal right to be here. They shouldn't get UBI because they're also not going to be paying taxes, which I think is an interesting concept because in the real world, and in my world, where I do represent a lot of undocumented workers, they are paying taxes. They are paying Social Security. Very often, Social Security is being paid into somebody else's account, but they're paying Social Security, right? But that's one issue. The second is they talk about the problem of holding a wealthy person who's going to be subjected to the taxes that have to be paid in order to pay for UBI. And their solution to preventing somebody from leaving town and going to a better tax jurisdiction is, well, we'll just tell you to give up all your wealth. You're free to go. It's a human right, but we take your money away from you, and then also will encourage some patriotism. Now, Albert Wenger, our presenter, I think very ably, and actually, more than ably, I think he gave a soaring argument for his position. I mean, there are some very, very important issues that I think are grappled with when we talk about something like UBI. But I must point out a couple of things. The first is that $12,000 per annum is not much money. It's not intended to be a lot of money. In fact, Wenger says, quote, It's just, the money would be enough to live on, but just barely. It might cover a room in a shared apartment, food and bus fare, which is the definition of how my child is living who wants to be a Shakespearean actor in New York City. All candor. It would reduce everybody to trying to be a Shakespearean actor in New York City. Right?
I was going to say empower, not reduce, but, you know.
That's true. Well, except that he does get minimum wage. Unfortunately, he complains he has to work nearly full-time, and which brings him pretty close to the $36,000 a year, which is generally regarded as a living wage in New York City for one person. And he decries the fact that he has to work so hard in order to follow his art. He's serious about it. The second point I'd like to make is that the dislocations associated with eliminating existing programs are significant. Social Security today, the average monthly payment is $1,400 a month, which is much more than the $1,000 UBI. And if you wait to your normal retirement age, which is 66 or 67, depending on who you are, it's $2,800 a month, which is far larger than what UBI is, and quite frankly, for most people, or for many people, is considered an inadequate amount of money in order to live decently in our society. There are other issues associated with the elimination of health insurance, government health insurance. You know, the average person, you may not know it, I do, because I pay not only for my own insurance, I pay for everybody else's insurance at my firm, right? But if you want to have decent insurance in New York City, family coverage, you're going to spend over $25,000 a year. That's what it costs. You may not realize it. I mean, somebody once said, people know how much their car insurance costs. They have no idea what their health insurance costs because they don't see the bill, right? But the amount of money is insufficient to do that. Now, there are solutions on an individual level. The longshoremen, 30 years ago, were confronted with the threat of containerization. They negotiated a lifetime wage for not having to show up. And there was a hall in Brooklyn I used to pass by. You had to show up at the hall, right? Put in your check, get credit, go home an hour later, right? One of the negative consequences, of course, is that they suffered high rates of suicide, alcoholism, divorce, all the things associated with having too much time on your hands and not having to go to work the next day, which unfortunately, because I have real life experience, we represent the union that has the Teamsters at the Javits Center. There's 3 categories: the guy who unloads the box, the guy who moves the box, and the guy who watches the guy moving the box, which we fight to keep because of safety reasons, I assure you.
Touche.
But you can make $120,000 a year for 6 months of labor there, and then you get unemployment the other 6 months because it's seasonal. They have far too much time on their hands and too much money, quite frankly, in their pockets. And so they get into lots of trouble. I mean, some of them wind up on the Post, on top of, I remember the Roosevelt tram. We had one of them on the top of the tram, drinking beer. I mean, it was on the front page of the paper.
You're too good a negotiator, Larry.
I have fought very hard. You have no idea. In any event, when you're a labor lawyer on the union side, you have to be incredibly practical. I mean, I think the debate is important. I think it raises incredibly important issues. But quite honestly, I'm not afraid of Andy Stern's Armageddon, because I know in my heart of hearts, if half of the people in the United States don't have a job, we're going to have one hell of a police state here, because that's not going to be tolerated. They're not going to allow revolution. The rich in this country are not going to hand over their accumulated wealth. They continue to accumulate it. Drugs will be completely free and legal, because that's a really good way of keeping people from purposeful misconduct. And I get that on authority from the guy who used to run the Bronx Police Department some years ago, said, thank God we have drugs and alcohol. We'd never be able to control the Bronx otherwise. So that would be helping. And there might be some mandatory conscription. Let's take people for 5 years and put them in the military, and we can have them do certain things that are good or bad, depending on your perspective. And there could be some redistribution of wealth, of some form of UBI, because that always helps. So I'm really not afraid that this system is going to all of a sudden collapse if things go off the rails. On the other hand, people project that in 100 years, only 2% of work will exist, leaving 98% of humanity not having to work, which poses an incredible tableau of what do we do about that, right? I mean, we can't have 98% of the people sitting around drinking beer. So how are we going to
Doesn't sound all
handle,
bad to me, honestly, but.
as a social system, may not be the best. And I think that UBI or some form of it may actually come to pass. I think these are big issues. I've watched, automation eliminate jobs for 35 years. We represent in my firm a lot of truck drivers. They don't have a clue what's coming. And it is coming. There's just no doubt about it. Lastly, I just want to point out that while I allowed the algorithm to select the books that I read, I used Grammarly in order to correct my writing. That's a computer program that advertises itself as a free writing assistant. It does a pretty good job, and I didn't have to hire anybody in order to proofread what I did. So with that, I will close my remarks and thank everybody.
Thank you, Larry. Any comments from the panel? I don't see any comments or questions from the floor. Please come to the microphone and identify yourself.
My name is Shimon Katz. I am a CPA and lawyer from Israel. I want to refer to Mr. Joseph Bless's speech about option and profit sharing. Before, I would like to say thank you to Professor Sam Esberger for inviting all of us from Israel. And with your permission, I would like to ask all the Americans to raise their hand. The American here in the room can raise their hand, one hand.
For what purpose?
Okay. There is in Hebrew a phrase called hakarat tov. Hakarat tov says in English, don't miss an opportunity to say thank you for someone who give you some good thing. And what Mr. Blessed talked about profit sharing and stock options, as a young CPA in Motorola was actually the first company who had a subsidiary out of America. In those days, there was a boycott from the Arab country against Israel, and Motorola Inc. decided to take a subsidiary in Israel. So they gave opportunity to do build. And as a young CPA, I asked one manager, Motorola Inc. manager, to say about the opportunity to give the employees options and stocks and profit sharing. And from those days, all the employees receive profit sharing and option, and that makes employee very good for those reasons. And that was thank you to all of them, all the American here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Please come to the microphone and identify yourself.
Hello. Okay. Hi, I'm Greg.
What's your last name, Greg?
Berdia. I actually know some of the members on the panel. So I just had a question about, we've been talking about a lot of nightmare scenarios, right? Like extreme sort of scenarios, and I'm more interested to hear what the panel's thoughts are for the coming decades. I agree some of the issues we've talked about are here and they are inevitable, but I'm curious if they don't go addressed in some of the ways we've discussed, what history has taught us, or what, like if none of these solutions are implemented, and the trends continue as is, like what, based on other countries or historical precedent, can be expected to happen. And I think it's important to agree on some basic like macroeconomic like assumptions in order to answer my question accurately. So what I'm coming from based on this morning's, because I know some of the people on this panel maybe were not at the morning talk, but like we talked about increased concentration of wealth, including like arguably monopolies, very large, like the Googles of the world, right? Controlling a lot of the technology and innovation that will automate out a lot of jobs. There's decrease in union participation. Wages are not rising with inflation for decades. An increasing percentage of the US population is in poverty or lower class, as well as upper class, but inequality has
Could you get to
increased.
the
So,
point, please?
Yeah, so those were just some assumptions I wanted to lay out, but my question was if that keeps going and we don't implement any of the
These
solutions
measures,
we've
right.
discussed, what might we expect in the coming decades?
Anyone want to tackle that? You know, it's very hard to predict the future. I'm not sure we have a comparative advantage in doing that. Is there a comment here? Go ahead. Joseph?
Well, I think that we have a relatively recent example of a big transition, right? The transition from the agrarian age to the industrial age is not that long ago, and it was bad because at the end of the agrarian age, the people who were in power were the people who controlled land, and when they saw what industry could do, they didn't think, this is about capital allocation. They thought, I can have tanks and battleships so I can have more land. And we're kind of repeating that same mistake, which is we're seeing everything through the lens of capital now, and we see computers and we go, we can have another Google, another Facebook, another $1 trillion of stock market capitalization. So I think we're making a similar mistake, which means we're trying to stay in the old structure and apply the new capabilities in the old structure. And the longer you do that, it's a little bit like taking a dam and having more and more water build up behind it and kind of patching the dam frantically. When it eventually breaks, it breaks all the more violently. And so I think the longer we dilly-dally and the longer we believe in incremental solutions, the worse it's going to get when it ultimately happens.
Any other questions or comments? Did you want to say something, Joseph?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, thank you. So I would say that the problem is going to flow over into politics, and I think we've seen this. Politics, I think, would destroy the middle class and the working middle class. Politics will be more extreme. Political parties who don't solve these problems will be seen as more incompetent, which they are. Congress will be seen as incompetent, and we'll have reduced support for capitalism, which is something that polling is showing among young people. And those are just a few comments.
Agree with all of that.
I have one question. My name is John Giannopoulos. Professor Blassie, your last slide talked about the Alaska Permanent Fund. And while I don't know much about it, it seems like that would be, as like on a state level, almost something the other panelists are advocating for, a universal income. Has there been any studies on the effects of at the state level with the Alaska Permanent Fund, and then how you could maybe
Joe, would you
expand that
describe it briefly?
nationwide?
Joel, describe it briefly.
Yeah, the Alaska Permanent Fund uses mineral and oil profit sharing that those companies gave to the state of Alaska to invest in a fund that holds non-carbon assets, which, like a DB plan, sort of throws off capital gains that are used to fund dividends for the people of Alaska. I'm really not the expert. You're the expert.
There's some very good studies on it. For instance, on the health impacts on people who move from other states to Alaska, and it's all basically positive. I mean, the amounts aren't very large; they're like $1,000 a year or something like that, and they vary from year to year. But nonetheless, even at those very low levels, the studies of this show very positive results. Incidentally, was passed by a Republican governor.
All right, we have time for one more and then a break before the 2 o'clock session. 3 o'clock session.
My name's Aaron Samsel. I'm an attorney with the National Labor Relations Board. I was wondering if any of the panelists had considered the concept of a universal basic dividend, where the government would own a certain percentage of all publicly traded companies and distribute that dividend publicly.
Anyone on the panel?
Well, it doesn't really, to me, it's another form of financing mechanism for a type of basic income, whether you call it basic dividend or freedom dividend or whatever you want to call these things. One of the things that's a reality is that the corporate tax incidence rate in the country is the lowest it's been, and in large part that's because we've allowed corporations to move intellectual property to low tax regimes and pay extraordinarily little in taxes. So I think a good starting point in my mind would be to just go back and actually taxing corporations. That would produce a lot of money that we could give to people.
If I could add, Sam.
Please.
We have a universal basic dividend program. We have it for the top 5, the named executive officers of the 3,300 companies on the stock market. We just computed from Standard & Poor's ExecuComp that on average, those 3,300 companies do exactly what Senator Sanders is talking, 0.5% of their equity to just their top
small
5
group.
executives every year. And I estimate 1% to 2% of their equity to their top 3% of managers every year. So we already have the plan, it's just socialism.
We have
for
the
rich.
structure, we just have to change the scale. Please join me in thanking this terrific panel.